behalf of the Kelly House Board, we welcome all of you to our 43rd History Talk. And so, one of the questions that came up many times when I was visiting, when visitors would ask, what's this about the water towers? They just noticed that there were water towers all over Mendocino. Well, today we're all going to hear about the water towers, and it's our great privilege to have with us Barry Cusick, who has been here for many years, and all of you, I'm sure, know him in one capacity or another. He's worn many hats in this community, and he has stories to tell about the water towers that maybe some of you have never heard before. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Barry Cusick. It's all yours, Barry.
I'm humbled talking about water towers to these folks who have been around water towers their whole life. And it reminds me of when I first moved here and lived in the Frank Brown house across from Gallery Fair, the Zimmer Gallery, the Oddfellows Hall. And in the evening I'd go around to Capella Street and help Mr. Dunn up and into a wheelchair and wheel up and down the street. And after I lived here, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months, I complained to Mrs. Dunn. You did never talk to anybody in their first name, and they're older than in the 70s. I said, I've lived here, 6 months, and people treat me like a newcomer. And she says, young man, I'm 74 years old, I've lived here 72 years, and they still treat me like a newcomer. After that, I gave up on it. I never became an old man, but I can't believe I'm sitting here talking to you folks. My experience with the water tower started out when I was about 10 years old, and my parents would pack me up and ship me to my great Uncle Helen and Aunt Dick's farm, which was west of Sebastopol, for summer camp for a month or so, and let them have some time off, and I'd get an airing out in the country from beautiful West Oakland. And one of the, and I say Uncle Helen and Aunt Dick, they're actually my great aunt and Uncle Helen was this huge woman with a huge voice and always wore coveralls, and she'd slap you on the back and reset your spine for you. And Aunt Dick always wore neatly pressed khaki clothes, and he was an artist and an engineer by trade. So they had a ranch out there. They grew sheep and raspberries and apples, which was pretty common. At the top of the hill, there was a water tower, just a simple one like this, and my job a couple of times a week was to go start up the gas pump, which had a leather belt that went to a piston pump that pumped the water from the well up into the water tank. And one of the first times I did it, I got busy with the sheep or frogs or something, and I overflowed the water tank with late summer water, and I got a licking from my Uncle Helen. So after that, I climbed up the water tower and I cleaned out the downspout, and I just settled down and read a book until the water hit me, and then I'd turn off the pump. So that was my beginning of the water tower, and I just loved climbing up it and the views and the power of the structure. I could feel it then, even when I was 10 years old. So what brings me here to talk to you about water towers? I had the experience of building or rebuilding 4 water towers here in town, one of which is the one at the Bayview Restaurant, and built the one from the ground up at Village Farmer House over here, and the old Ernie Anderson place, and then rebuilt a couple of them, including the Zaka water tower down there where I had started Wind and Weather. I also ran the laundromat. I don't know if you remember what a great businessman than I was back then. I bought the laundromat just in the beginning of the big drought in 1977. And as soon as I bought it, you know, from Betty Dostal, it started running out of water quite regularly. And I bought a big yellow 1948 GMC tank truck. It looked like a Tonka truck. It was a truck and trailer. And from the South Coast Fire District, and I started hauling water to the laundromat. The laundromat would close at 9, and I'd bring the truck down about 10 and deliver water there, 1,500 gallons at a time at 10, 1 in the morning, 3 or 4 in the morning, pumping the water up and sleeping in the cab while the little gas pump was filling the tank. And then going up to the high school, I got my water from the high school or other sources around then. And get the water from the high school and then fill up the truck and bring it down. And during the day, I delivered water around town to a lot of the businesses and residences in town. And during that time, I had the opportunity to talk with a lot of the old timers here about their wells. I'd sometimes go down and clean them for them, lower the pump, and as we all have done, lower it further and further down in the well. Or climb up the water towers and try and fix the tanks, putting in a plastic liner or something like that. So I got just involved with the water towers from that level. And then as many of you will remember, where Mendocino is now, Miles Paoli had his TV repair shop there in the old Paoli Hotel. He lived next door in the stucco house. And there was a log out front, and a lot of the old timers would get there in the afternoon and tell stories, and you know, Miles Paoli and Herman Fail, and sometimes Foggy come over after work, and Ernest Andre or Bear Madera, they'd all go over there and talk to each other, and I'd sit there and listen to stories, a lot of which were about water towers. And then when I was delivering water to Nanny Escola or Mabel Gibbs or Nina Hicks, I listened to stories about, you know, Mendocino from all of them. So that's how I got interested in water towers. Maybe while I'm sitting here in front of you, I'm not sure yet. Another thing that happened was the water tower, the Heiser water tower, blew over right across Ukiah Street. That was quite an event for me, and that was owned by the Thompson family, then the Heiser property. He sold it to Bob Peterson. But Spencer, the son, got all the lumber from that and started his hippie lumber yard that used to be next to Ken Schroed's remedy shop there, empty, where there's a hippie lumber yard now. And then Jim Coupé, and here, let me pass around some photos here. This is Jim and I building the water tower that we bought from the Mendoza family. And we moved the water tower down there and laid it all out. And we made a deal with them. We'd take it down and bought it cheap. We had to buy workman's compensation insurance. We had to buy liability insurance, and that was the most expensive thing about the whole project. And so we brought the tower down and had all the beams stacked up there next to, as you'll see, the old sign is there from Homer's Market. So it's stacked up there in the yard. And I'm getting ready to build the first thing I'd ever built in my life from the ground up. And this water tower. And we poured the foundation, and I was about to cut the first piece of wood I'd ever cut for the new building, which was a 12 by 12-foot long beam. And we had to cut the ends off of all of them because they were rotten. And so I'm sitting there, and being a kid of the 60s or 70s, I had a pocket calculator, one of those little handheld pocket calculators, and I had a carpenter's protractor, and I was calculating how to make the compound cut here on the first beam to go up. And I'll explain the water tower right here as we're looking at it. The water towers historically are based on what's called the Queen's Cross, which dates back to Elizabethan England, Shakespeare, and English Tudor, and it's a way of attaining shear in a multi-story wooden structure. And that's this, and it gives it shear this way, and this way. The only problem with the shear as far as the old water tower is concerned is that now you have to have a shear horizontal this way. And then, of course, the biggest problem with the old water towers is the connections. The beams were just toenailed with long spikes into each other, and the old timers depended on the weight of the water to push down and hold the tower together. And when the scariest time for a water tower was when the tank was empty. If the wind blew, that's when the towers went over. If the tank was full, the tower didn't go anywhere. Taking down the water tower, I think we took it down in November. It used to be right in the little square behind the barn, right at the end of Pine Street, that water tower there. And Mendoza's had scabbed some 2x4s here and there on it over the years to strengthen it because the ends had rotted out. So we drained the water out and we started climbing up, and the tower literally started moving like that. So we had to go back and put more scabbing 2x4s on it and then climb up. And I wanted to save the water tank. Now, I didn't know that water tanks usually succumb to what's called sandwich rot. And that's a rot that, you know, you can put redwood all the way underneath the water and it won't rot, and you can take it out and leave it on land, on something, you know, in the air, and it won't rot. But if you submit it to drying and wetting, it's going to rot. And so what happens is the middle of each stave here in the water tank rotted out. So the middle, like a sandwich, each side on the outside looked great, and the middle was full of water, and it was funky and rotten. So it was freezing cold up there, and I wanted to save the tank, and so we took the bands off and laid some of the staves out with a rope wrapped around my waist, and I had a 2x4 driven into the deck here. And I said, okay, kick it over, and they kicked it over, and it weighed a lot more than I thought. And the board came loose, and I started skittering across the deck, and then let go, and when they hit the ground, they just splintered into 100 pieces. So we gave up on saving the tank and just threw the thing down. And eventually we took it down, and Phil Brock helped us, and Danny Costa, I think. They both became contractors after this. But so we took the tower down and brought it over and had it set up there in the yard next to Homer's. And I'm sitting there with my pocket calculator, calculating that, let's see, the average water tower in Mendocino goes in 1 foot for every 10 feet that it goes up. That's the proportion you see here, and that's that nice light proportion, not like the stumpy ones that some people build these days. So I was sitting there calculating, and now let's see, it's a compound cut. And Jim O'Donnell came down the street, and you remember he had eyeglasses thick as Coke bottles, and he says, "What are you doing there, young man?" And I stood up, and I said, "Well, I'm going to build this water tower here." And he says, "Well, that's good." And he says, "What's that?" And I said, "That's a pocket calculator." And I'm calculating the 1 in 10, and that's about 3.6 degrees, this and that. And he says, "You don't need that." And he took his cane and he flipped it into the beams. He said, "Go get me a carpenter square." I didn't own a carpenter square. So I ran over to Mendoza's and I came back with my carpenter square that I still use. And he says, "Now let's see." He says, this is a tower, it should be 1 in 10. So you go 1 inch back there and 10 down there, because it's a compound, you go a 1/2 inch, and you go around each side. There's your cut right there, young man, that's it. I said, "That's amazing. How did you know that?" He says, "I built this tower the first time." I settled down and said, "All right." So, of course, every day it came by how's it going there, young man? And so after a couple of weeks, he came by and he says, I built this tower the first time, I put it up in 3 days. I said, well, this is a lot more complicated now. We have to have steel gussets. And yeah, that's okay. And he says, and I put it up, there was just 2 of us. What they did originally was they put a jack pole, which was used a lot in the logging days, and that was just a tree, skin tree that went up a lot taller than the water tower. And they planted it in the middle there. And then he had a donkey that went down Pine Street, and they had all the beams pre-cut and laid out down Pine Street. And then they attached the beach beam to the jack pole, to the rope coming down from the top of the jack pole, so that when they picked it up, it had just the right angle to it to go into place. And then they had another rope that would come out, and they'd hold it, and then toenail it in place, and put the next set of beams around this way, cut those and put them in, and so that's how they put the whole tank up, the tower up in 3 days. It took me a year and a half. And most of the time was spent doing the stairway. And then Lee Welty got his nose into it, and we had to put the shear in this way, and it had to be plywood shear, and to keep the plywood from rotting, we hot mopped it, but we didn't have enough money to actually have a roofing company do it, so we had a 55-gallon drum full of tar with a fire underneath it, and we just get to where it's boiling, about to flame over, and then dip a bucket in and haul it up and hot mop it. But we did that on all 3 levels. And right now, the one in the northeast corner, this beam is going to be replaced because it has a conch rot in the middle, which is where the middle rots out and the outside looks normal. So Scott Anderson is going to be replacing that beam down there. So we built that up, and of course the real reason and the commercial push behind building this water tower right here was to get access to the 2nd floor, which was, before that time, Homer lived up there, Homer Little. They had a place out in Coffee Road. They lived there also, and he used to raise orchids up there. I'm telling you guys, but you know all that. And if you look at the funny windows on the front of the store back then, they went up like that, and that's where Homer had his lilies. So we gained the access to the 2nd floor, and that was the big thing, was to get the Bayview restaurant located there and going. So that was the first water tower in town. And probably, there's a real reason why Mendocino has so many water towers. The famous photograph that's taken over there from Crestwood Hill, where you can identify 40-something water towers from one photograph. And then the archaeological and historic evidence that points out there were 70-something water towers here in town. It requires a couple of prerequisites to have water towers. One is that it can't freeze. You can't have hard freezes because the tank would freeze and crack. The packer head, the pump down at the well would freeze and crack. The pipes would freeze and crack. And you wouldn't get any water when it's frozen anyway. So it can't freeze. And windmills, air motors, like to have this slow, constant wind. And our ambient wind here in the summertime is 14 miles an hour from the northwest, and that's just perfect for just constant going around. And the third reason is shallow water table, because windmills don't work that well with a really deep well. They do better with shallower wells, and part of it's just the technology available at the time. And so water towers didn't really exist as we know them prior to 1854, when the guy named Daniel Halliday, patented it. He was a mechanic in New England, and he patented the air motor. And of course, from 1854 until the common use of the electric pressure pump, there were a lot of different air motors, US, Halliday, and of course the most common was air motor, which is still in production in Texas. You can walk in buy a brand new air motor and put it up. And So that's the three basic reasons. And then the other is that Mendocino during the boom times, and Mendocino had its boom and bust times, just like we have boom and bust times now. The people had a lot of money and they built elaborate water towers, not just water towers. And I remember some water towers when I was growing up down West Oakland. They were on the old estates there. And here, everybody had at least a water tower like this. And you know, you look at the magnificent water towers behind the Blair House or the Johnson Water Tower. I mean, they were something that exhibited wealth beyond just having a fancy house. The reason for the water tower is that you put the water up in the air and you have a gravity pressure into your house. And most of the houses had plumbing on the first floor, not the second, because when the water tower is 30 feet up in the air, it only develops 15 pounds of water pressure. That's half a pound per foot, generally speaking. So if you put a bathroom on the second floor, you really only have about 10 pounds of water pressure. To make up for that, all the pipes that went up in the water tower, if you look at them, if you go around to some that haven't been restored yet, like maybe Connie's parents, Florence's parents, excuse me, they still, you see the old, big, fat galvanized pipes, 1.5, 2 inch pipes for all the water flowing around in there, because the lower the pressure, the larger the pipe you need. It's like same as electricity. Your battery cable at 12 volts is much bigger than your household wiring at 110 volts. Same thing with water. So you have the water pressure coming down. Now the way they worked is the air motor. I drew a diagram, but it's really awful. There's a good one in the water tower book. And I'll pass this around, but there's a much better one in the book there, but here, pass that around. And here's a picture of the packer head here. And that's on the top of the well, underneath the water tower. Generally speaking, the air motor, the windmill, has to be directly over the well. So the windmill goes around, the fan of the windmill goes around, and it has a shaft going in. It's just like the crankshaft in a car. When it goes in, it goes like that. It goes through, and connected to that is a tie rod, and that turns it into an up and down motion. And each time, a 6-foot air motor goes around, the shaft only goes up and down 3 or 4 inches, not very much. And then that goes down to the packer head, which is on top of the well, and the shaft goes into the packer head, which has got water in it, and then it goes into, it's threaded into a pipe, and it goes down the ground, underneath the water, and then there's a piston there. And so the shaft comes down, the wooden shaft comes down, and it turns into a steel shaft, and the steel shaft goes all the way down to where the piston goes up and down, and then you have a leather valve that, when the piston is going up on the bottom of the cylinder pump, lets the water in, and then as it goes down, a leather valve on the top lets the water up, and so the piston goes up and down. And each time it goes around one time, it pumps about a cup, maybe 2 cups of water. That's all, each revolution. So it's very slow, but it goes constantly, and it pumps the water into the packer head, and then there's a spigot that comes out. If you open the spigot, the water would run into a bucket. Close the spigot, it pressurizes it, goes out a pipe in the back, and up and fills the water tank, and then you have the constant water pressure coming down and into your house. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, how deep is the aquifer?
Well, here in Mendocino, there's technically no aquifer. An aquifer is like Sacramento Valley, where you have a homogeneous gravel basin. And there's water floating in the gravel, and you put a straw down, and if you put the straw down all over, it's going to be a certain level, and that's the aquifer. Here we have the Franciscan Formation, the orange soil. It's sitting on top of the sandstone, the gray wacky, the black stone, and the water goes down through the sand, and it sits on top of the black stone. And all the hand-dug wells here in town are dug down by hand. That's why they're 3-4 feet in diameter, because you have a guy down there digging it. And they go down and they hit the top of the black hard rock, and that's where the best water is. And that's where we're all getting by right now. It's just that water right there that's skimming along the top of the rock. A modern well drills past that, seals it past that, and goes down and drills through the fractures in the black rock, hoping to hit a fracture with water in it. And if you go down to the ocean edge, and you look at the black rock, you're going to see green algae that's growing. It's real slippery algae. It's slipperier than anything out in the ocean. And that's the fresh water coming out of the cracks in the black rock, and that's what you try and hit with a deep well. All of these air motors were running on hand-dug shallow wells that were just 30 feet at the deepest. The water tower, the old well at my house over here was 8 feet deep. And there's plenty of water at 8 feet. So it's inconsistent and there's no aquifer, so to speak. Our community services district has spent $1 million discovering that. Anyway. So, yeah, 15 pounds pressure. Okay. I'm moving right along here. Yeah. So when I built the water tower over here at Village Farm, remember it was at the height of the eco-fad in the late 70s or 80s, excuse me, and I said I'm going to have this functioning air motor, gravity, pressure thing, the whole thing, and I bought an air motor and put it up there and fired it up, and to my amazement, it splashed oil all over the whole yard. The shingles, the flowers, the top of the well. And I thought, well, this is terrible. I ran over to Sid Spring and I said, Sid, my air motor's splashing oil all over. And he says, they always do. They say that, when the pump's going around to lubricate the sleeves, the splashing oil and the little galvanized top you have on it, you can't have it go down the outside. I mean, you can't have it go down the inside because it'll fill up with water when it rains. Let's go down the outside, so the water splashes up on that, and that leaks out, and that hits the propeller, and it just splashes all around. So I went home and disconnected it. I said, heck with that. So it's just eyewash now. You just look at it and it looks pretty. It's rusted and it's fallen over now. But I remembered back when I was delivering water to everybody, and you guys lived with these wells, remember, between the air motor and oiling the sleeve of the packer head constantly, and then when they converted to gas pumps to pump the water up, the tops of all the old oil of the wells were all covered with oil from all this going on. Of course, the oil in the old days, and the old timers lived a long time, the oil in the old day didn't have any additives, and so I think you could actually drink a lot of oil and it wouldn't hurt you. Don't quote me, Doc. So, anyway, the old timers do live a long time here. I mean, it's remarkable. I was just thinking of Jim O'Donnell when he was in his mid-80s. We had a fire call, and he was up. It was for a man in a tree, and we went over there, and here's Jim O'Donnell, and he was pruning the feathers on a cypress tree. The feathers get real long, and before winter you have to cut the feathers off the branches. And he's 85 years old or something, and he was up there on the end of a ladder, and he fell down in the crotch of the branch and like that, legs like that, and he turned off his chainsaw and threw it down, and he called for help, and what had happened is he had the ladder up against the tree, and the ladder slipped, and then he fell down like that. So we went over there, and Jim, what are you doing up there? So he was up there cutting the feathers, and so I put the ladder back. He says, "Just put the ladder back, young man." So I put the ladder up against the tree, and he put his foot over, and he climbed down the tree, and he picked up chainsaw, started it, and climbed back up. So I think drinking that oil wasn't entirely So Alvin, I was talking about a story. I think I heard this from you about there's a brake on the air motor, and in fact, in that picture I just passed around, there's a broken wooden lever, and there's a wire that went from the lever at the bottom of the water tower up to the air motor, and as you pulled down on it, it aligned the vane with the when you pulled down on it, it took and made the vane of the windmill go parallel to the fan, so that it wouldn't go in a high wind, or you could turn it off if your water tank was full. I think that you related to me about one time you were supposed to, your mom told you to turn off the water tower.
Oh, well, actually, we had a tower at home and with a windmill, and one of my jobs were to pump water. And in between our garages, we had the wire came down and over there, and you just pulled this bar off and brought it over and let it pump for an hour, 2 or 3. And so I was complaining one day, there was no, my story, I think it's the same one, that I didn't have any water. And my father said, "Have you been pumping?" And I said, "No," and so that was a good lesson.
Well, the story that I heard, and I can't remember who it was from, was that a storm was coming, and you have to turn off the fans when a storm's coming, because they'll just blow apart. And what happened, and I don't know if you remember, when I started Wind and Weather, I bought this great big, it was a 10-foot diameter air motor, and I had it up inside the water tower. I had the weather vanes attached to it, very artsy. And all of the tips of the fans were bent, and I asked the farmer I bought it from why they were bent. And what happens when the fan is on in a high wind is that you have a bolt that holds the fan onto the shaft that goes in. And in a high wind, you know how the wind goes, and then it stops. And so this fan gets going, and it stops, and gets going and stops, and pretty soon it wears off the bolt or lets it off, and when the wind stops, the fan just takes off right off the windmill, and it goes spinning down through the field, and that it bent the tips of every fan evenly. So I straightened it out as best I could. It held up the weather vanes just fine. And, I can't remember now who told me the story. I thought it was you, Alvin, but as somebody that was born and raised here, and their job was to pump the water, and his mom yelled at him, "Now, go shut off the windmill." And he was busy and forgot about it, and pretty soon the wind's starting to really howl, and he goes over and he pulls, and he's playing with a buddy, and he pulls the lever down, which goes to the wire, which moves it like that, because the wind was blowing so hard, it didn't want to come like that, because the vane wants to stay in the wind, and the fan wants to stay in the wind. So he broke the wire, and he didn't get in trouble and break the air motor. So they climbed up top of the water tower, and they waited for the wind to slow down, and he and his buddies, they took off their shirt, and when it slowed down, they reached out and they grabbed the fan with their shirts, and he was on the he was on the inside, and his buddy was on the outside, and so they grabbed it, and it lifted his buddy right up over the railing and right down, and here he was hanging onto the fan 30 feet off the ground. So anyway, he was still up there, so he grabbed his buddy and hauled him over, and then they manually closed the windmill. So I think there was a lot of life living with these windmills. Anybody else have any stories that grew up with these windmills? Anyway,
I have a question.
yeah.
With all these windmills, did each farmer, I guess each one person was responsible for maintenance on their own windmill, or was there a grease guy that went around and oiled all the windmills? And when the wind blew big, did each one of them squeak and make a horrible noise?
They do squeak and make a horrible noise. I can vouch for that because I built done me. Here's the water tower I built, and there's a picture here of the inside. I built a beautiful apartment inside, and the apartment was unlivable when the windmill was going. It just made a lot of noise and crack and shook and everything. I don't think so. I think everybody was very independent in the old days, and they did all their own stuff. Could be wrong. There were handy people like Ernest Andre that might have went around, but who knows? I'm passing around pictures of the water tower that I built in 1989 at the house over here. And that was a whole new style of construction. Instead of using the Queen's Cross and using big beams, I built that with 2x6 studs like a normal house. And then it has plywood sheeting on the outside and plywood sheeting on the inside, nailed every 4 inches to give it a lot of shear. It's a very stiff building. And so that freed up, when designing it that way, it freed up the ability to put windows without beams in front of them in the middle of the building. And then of course, there's French doors down there, and there's an arch into the kitchen and so forth. And you can't do that with this construction because you can't take out any of these beams. You lose your shear. So that, and then Chauncey Sears, he built his water towers, I think, with using studs instead of beams. And Dennis McCroskey's new water towers are all built with beams. So that's, of course, you have to always end up every talk with the future water towers. And well, it's funny talking about the futures of something historic and historically dead as far as utility. But the review board now has an ordinance, called demolition by neglect, and I think that will pretty much hold up all the water towers that are here in town now, because they actually have the right to proceed against you if the tower is falling down. And then even though the historic ordinance hasn't changed from the 6 years I was on the board in the 70s, everybody has learned that the best way to get approval from the Historic Review Board is to replicate existing architecture. And so I expect that people will be trying to, or will be building water towers like Jennifer did over there on Little Lake Street that replicate the architecture to get approval for a new structure in Mendocino. And there are also existing structures in town, like the shoe building where the shoe store, the cobbler used to be. Thomas Root was there. It's in the behind the red house, behind the Warren Hagemeyer house. You'll see a funny square building. And that was the base of the Johnson Water Tower. And the Johnson Water Tower was one of the tallest in town. It was 4 stories high, and it took care of water for the whole block there. And that shop is most of the first floor of that water tower. And if you ever see the door open, stick your head in and take a look at the magnificent beams in that shed. And if you look on the north side of it, you'll see a funny little board that I left when I restored the building, where the packer head used to be bolted to the building. And then that building was, I don't know if you recall, it used to be right out in Calpella Street. And the well was underneath it in Calpella Street. And then when we restored the red house and greenhouse, we had to move it back and fill in the well. But I left that board there, and you can look and you can see where the old packer head was attached to it. So that water tower went up 4 stories, and it was a magnificent water tower. And of course, the higher the water tower, the more water pressure you had.
But, you know, that water tower, fell. In fact, Florence's brother and myself were, playing in that thing, going way up in it, you know. And the day before, when we got down, and her father said, well, you kids stay off of that water tower. And we kind of concluded, you know, and the next day it fell down. True story. You know?
Yeah, well, in the water tower book, take a look at it, there's a picture of it at its height. You know, when it had all the Victorian Guga on it, and then there's a picture of it toward the end when a lot of it, probably when you were up there, when a lot of the outside was falling off the water tower.
Well, just a lot of it fell down, and, so,
Yeah, well,
your dad told us.
if you
No,
get
I
a chance,
didn't do
stick
it.
stick your nose in and take a look at those beams. Thomas Rood, I don't know if you remember him, he was a sculptor and a carver, and he carved the beams. You never leave a carver with big beams, you know. Anyway, they're all carved up. So that's it. Any questions or comments or more stories from the guys that are older than dirt here? I'm sorry, Ellen. You're the youngest one.
Not by much.
Higgins?
Yeah.
Are there weight restrictions on the size of the tank that these towers can hold?
You know, with the stick-built, with the tower I have there, it's engineered to have 3,000 gallons up here. And Lee always reminds me that it was engineered to have 3,000 gallons, and it's stronger with the 3,000 gallons than without it.
Right.
Because he engineered it using the weight. I never did, because these engineers go crazy. I mean, it's a lot worse now. When you build anything now, you have to go down, there's 14 yards of concrete underneath that water tower there. And then there's hold downs that come up and grab that beam, and then there's steel gussets that go up and grab that beam, and there's gussets that grab from this beam through to this beam through to this beam, and from here to here, and then up into here and down. And so it's just like any modern construction. The tower is one unit, and the water isn't as important as it used to be, but the stick-built water towers can hold a lot of water.
3,000 gallons.
Yeah, 3,000 gallons.
So there weren't any tanks much bigger than that here in town?
Yeah, there were. The Zonka tower down there, the Jarvis Nichols water tower.
It's a double one?
Yeah, it's a double one. The bottom one is 3,000, the top one is 5,000. So there's a total of 8,000 gallons on that tower. The top one is empty. It's just eyewash. The bottom one we still use it. A lot. And now we're buying water, of course, we're out of water.
How many of the water towers that we see do you think are actually being used, other than just as eye candy, but would you say half of them or more?
Oh, no, I think we can count on one hand. The John Sears water tower has water of it. I think Dennis McCroskey's. The Jarvis Nichols water tower, the Heiser water tower. I don't know, when they rebuilt the Sanko house, Alvin, do you know if that water tower that they rebuilt?
I'm not sure.
Stump tower?
The stone water tower, in the stone Lansing building,
Yeah.
like my sister and I own that.
Yeah.
That has a liner in it, and that has a tank in it.
Yeah, so the Lansing water tower, so maybe a dozen, yeah.
But those wooden tanks like that, I mean, they're nice, but they have all those cracks. And once you get any bacteria in them, you just can't get rid of it.
Yeah.
Because there's just thousands of places for stuff to get in between
Yeah.
them, and you just can't get rid of it.
Don't tell any of my tenants. No. We have a liner, in there.
Well, if you have a liner,
Yeah,
it's better.
but the liner doesn't do the tank any good. It accelerates the rotting of the wood. Redwood should be wet or dry.
Do you have your eye on any others to restore?
No, I don't. Actually, when I walk into the shoe building, I think, that would be really fun to, there are some pictures. This is a picture of when I went to work for Jim Coupe at the old deli. And then this is a picture of the laundromat.
That's a long time ago,
yeah.
I've forgotten about
Hey,
that.
but before Bayview, what was that restaurant called?
The fisherman.
No, but your son, your kid.
Oh, Brandon's Bayview,
Yeah.
named for Brendan and Shannon, my
Yeah.
son and daughter.
I was gonna get a plug for your kid.
Thanks.
The construction of the tanks must have been a specialty. Were they done locally?
Yeah, and I think, we all participated. The tank is on sleepers on top of the deck, and they go opposite the beams, which go this way, and then you have sleepers going this way that are the shape of the tank, 4x6s or 4x8s. And then you lay out the base of the tank, and you nail together, toenail, just hold it together there. And you start out with one stave, and it's kind of a circus. You toenail that in, and you put the next stave to it, and you get lathing, like lattice, like garden lattice, when you make a lattice thing out of it. And you nail the staves together with the lattice inside and out, and just small little nails. And you just go around toenailing and putting the lattice around until you get all the way around it. And then you put on the steel bands and tighten it up, and then you take off the lattice. And during that, in the 70s, I helped build with John Wessler, and when everybody was putting up water tanks, I helped build a lot of those. It's fun, a little frustrating sometimes if you have a wind or something, but and then when you fill them up, they leak. So you have to go around with a mallet and pound on them and tighten and pound on them, and hope that when they get wet that they tighten up. And if they don't tighten up, then you throw in sawdust, and the sawdust goes down and goes into the cracks as they're leaking out. Or little redwood pegs and peg them into the holes, but they all leak a little bit.
We had tanks like that when I lived out on Big River, but they sat on top of redwood stumps, yeah. And I always wondered how they put those up there, because they were huge, but the one by the house always leaked. The water always ran down the sides of the tank and everything.
When I drew that little diagram of the well, I drew I don't know if you saw it, salamanders and frogs in the well.
Happy.
When we moved over to Anderson's house over the Freethy, you guys remember Clarence Freethy? When I bought the house, I bought it for $51,000. I think Clarence had the first for $3,000 on it, and he came over and interviewed us to see if we were good enough for him to carry that note. And so he told a lot of stories. And I asked him, I said, Clarence, I said, if the picture of the house there, I don't know if any of you remember, but there was one side of the porch, and half of the south-facing wall was painted with ochre paint, and not the rest of the house. And I said, Clarence, how come just this and this is painted? He said, well, about 10 years ago, I decided I was going to paint the house. I went over to Mendoza's and bought a gallon of paint and started painting, and I realized how much it would cost, so I just quit. Anyway, so the lower well there, which is where the air motor was, there was an air motor originally on the water tower. And there's some pictures of the old water tower that I replicated over there. But that well wasn't a very good well. And the well down in the field was a really good well. In fact, they had a bottling works there. It's been documented. And it was originally Johnson Spring. If you look at the old fire insurance maps. They show Johnson Spring, and there's a card going around that shows this huge pond, much larger than the pond that's there now, and looking up toward Gene Rice's house, and you get a sense of just how big that pond was at the time. Well, when they filled in, I think that the pond was created when they filled in Ukiah Street, and that jammed up Johnson Spring, making the pond. And then when they filled in the pasture down there, they built a brick tunnel like this, and it's about 15 feet long. And it goes toward the pond, and then it goes into a dome like this. And when I looked down it, I'd see snakes and salamanders and frogs in it, which was real common for all these shallow wells, because there was light and there's a wood slat top, And we lived at that well just fine. The kids grew up just fine. And one day, when my sheep jumped up on top of the well and went pee, and I could hear it going into the well. So then we drilled a new well up where the water tower is now, and that's sealed in good water. The other is irrigation water. Anyway, so that was
We all survived.
that was a good well.
Were those tanks in the late 70s? I know there's a tank maker either in Healdsburg or
Brown,
Cloverdale.
Brown Tank Company.
Well, I remember Bellagio.
Oh, yeah, Bellagio also, yeah.
Bellagio. And then after water tower, the big ones, it was hot tubs.
Yeah.
The smaller 6 foot tall instead of.
Yeah, and they were buying old wine tanks and, milling them down and reusing them for water too. Any other comments? Stories? Memories? No?
We didn't have snakes or anything in the water tower, but my dad pumped water out of the river with a water wheel and a pump.
Oh,
So, and it didn't have a screen on it, so sometimes you'd open the water in the sink and there'd be little tiny fish swimming in the water. And we had 2 of them, one down below the barn, which he irrigated, because he raised vegetables and sold to town, but he put the pipes out and you'd go out in the field sometimes and there'd be little fish swimming around, so it was my job to pick up the fish, take them back to the river.
In the water tower book, I don't know if I have the same one that you have, I can't see the one here, but there's a picture of the gigantic windmill running the sawmill. Do you know how that might have worked, or how?
I don't think it worked very well. It didn't last very long. It is.
Oh, that white book on
Yeah,
the
there we
top
go.
shelf.
And
Oh.
it was,
I think Wally wrote that book, didn't he?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's sawmill, and here's the air motor, the fan. And I think it says just how long Heezer's windmill helped turn logs and boards with no idea. Anyway, great book.
For those who don't have the book, they're for sale for $12.
Well, thanks for coming.
We thank you very much, Barry, for this interesting afternoon.
My name is Susie Long. I have a gallery in Barry's water tower. He's my landlord. And I'd like to invite you all to come down and look at the building. If you've never been in it, I'll open up the stairs and let you climb up to my studio so you can go into the water tower and see what that looks like. And you can do that this afternoon. It'd be fun.
It's fun to think about that water tower. It was a hair salon.
Where is that?
Before
Mm-hmm.
artists, and then a hair salon. I think.
Was the hair salon twice?
No, I know. At first it was Zaka built it for an artist studio, and then it was a hair salon, and then I started in the weather there in '74 or '5, and it stayed there until before Greg. Yeah. Anyway, it's
Well, they moved to Casper first.
Casper. No, that was the retail moved to Fort Bragg. Warehouse in Casper. Now, of course, it's in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Is this your dog swimming in the pond?
Yeah, that was cheap.
Have they done much documentation on how buildings were used, and then, what the next use was, and then the next use?
The Community Services District is starting to keep really close track of it. And I think now, but historically, I'm not sure. I think of that, just the Jarvis Nichols building is like a nutshell game, the way things have moved around in the 25 years that we've owned it. It's, things are always changing. Right now, during the heyday of retail, the second floor there was retail, and now with, actually, when Bill Zaka converted it, he built, there were 10 apartments there, 9 apartments, and little artist work studios. Dora Bothwell was where Lighthouse Realty was, and Jack Price, remember Jack Price? He was living in Middle Ridge. Anyway, Leon Walden's husband. Anyway, he lived there when he was building his. Anyway, so there were a lot of residences there, and then when retail became the hot thing, then those went to retail, and of course, the Community Services District charged the conversion fee, or when we originally hooked up the sewer district in '76, they charged commercial, and then with it going back, they want to charge us to go back to retail, to residential. But now the residential demands, there's more demand for residential than commercial. So it just, it flows. But I think the Community Services District really needs a close look at it.
Yeah, but all that old history of,
You just have to look at the newspaper ads, I guess, and
figure out what buildings are what buildings.
or ask Alvin or Connie or Hank. Yeah.
Alvin is an expert.
Well, yeah.
Careful.
What was in the building on the corner across from the Masonic Hall before the barber shop?
Kelly.
A bar.
There was a bar there?
With the barber shop, there used to be a bar. Joe King's Bar. Right, Florence?
Yeah.
Joe King's Bar.
Interesting.
That's a long time ago.
I was just reminiscing and looking at the picture of Jim and I. If you look in the back, you see the McCallum House and the back of the Baptist Church, and which is corners of the mouth. And I reminisce of the Bob Avery when the Kelly estates or McCallum estate sold that property. It included the McCallum House, the Baptist Church, the old barn here, Kelly Ellen Hall. And Bob Avery, you all remember Bob when he lived here anyway, he bought it for $250,000 all that. And he bought it, I think, on a Friday, and he just couldn't sleep all weekend because he spent way too much money, and went in to see Charlie Reed, and Charlie Reed turned around and that weekend sold it to Bill and Sue Norris for $275,000. The movie they made here where they brought down the cable real fast. The Russians are coming, and they brought the cable down and cut down everybody. Remember, the town used to look like a porcupine. If you look at old pictures of it, everybody had a 30-foot antenna, and you could get real hazy. What was it? Eureka. 49ers were playing. They couldn't see the football when they threw it.
6-3.
Yeah.
What?
6-3.
6-3. Like overnight, they wanted to film that movie here, and they went through and cut down all the antennas and hooked up everybody to cable. And I mean, this is a process going on. But you think of all the buildings that were halls in the old days. You had the Baptist Hall and the Masonic Hall. You had the Oddfellows Hall, Apple Hall, the Catholic Hall, the Presbyterian Hall, and everybody every night went out and did things for their community and went to the halls, and some of them drank, some of them didn't, some were anti-drinking, and then when TV came, everybody stayed home and watched TV.
I'm not so sure that was good.
Yeah.
That's why nobody visits anymore.
And now you got even narrower commuters.
Yeah.
And they refused to turn the TV off.
Well, enough of that.
Thank you.
It's all down in that area.
that's me with the hair. And this is Jim Coupe. It has a different roof line. And here's the Homer's Market. It used to be the deli, and now it's I think, Bay Trading Company. And then you see this trellis here. Homer used to raise vegetables in the back. Here, this is the Anderson house.
Okay.
Louis Anderson's house. And the water tower originally was right against the house. And I moved it over when I rebuilt it to make room for the kitchen.
Heritage.
And this was built by J.D. Johnson, and he used to build coffins to earn cash money, and his coffin making table is in this barn here. It's 14 feet long, and no, it's in town. It's between the Beaujolais and the Rec Center.
Yeah, there used to be a big slough here.
Okay.
Yeah.
A big slough here,
Yeah,
you know?
So it was a naturally watered place.
yeah. There's the
Water
pond,
right on top of the ground.
the pond still has a couple of feet of water in it, and ducks and fish.
And so is this a 3-story?
Yeah, well, it's 4 levels with 5 things.
I'm gonna
There's 2
go up,
tanks at the
okay.
top. There's 3 levels inside. My studio's way at the top.
This is good exercise.
Yeah, it's pretty warm up there. There's been a little bit of breeze.
What a nice view. View from the water tower. Susie Long's art studio in the water tower. Water tower to water tower.
See up there.
Oh, I'm looking at the other water tower.
Oh, that's the Heiser water tower.
The Heiser, yes.
He built that one in the 70s when it fell
Okay,
down.
yes.
That's the one that fell down because it was empty.
I've never seen that yard from above like this.
Isn't it pretty?
It is.
They put in a pond and they keep replacing the fish because the birds and the raccoons
Oh.
come and eat the fish.
Really, this is great.
Yeah, that's a good shot, you know.
Really.
Down there.
3 stories of water tower. So this one here is the one.
Yeah,
the,
this is where you are now. It's the Zaka Tower.
It is called the Zaka
Because
tower.
Zaka put the walls on it. See, the
Okay.
building was erected in the 1850s.
Uh-huh.
And Zaka first put walls on it and turned it into his home or studio. I think Lucia said they lived here. Okay, can you zero in on this picture? All these water towers have windmills still attached.
Oh, I see. And this one once had a windmill.
Oh yeah, they
Yes.
all yeah. And
Oh.
I have never seen a picture of this one with its windmill.
Oh, neat.
So these are the houses up on Ukiah Street.